Rainwater dripped from the hem of my dress onto the marble floor as 2 security guards grabbed my arms in front of 300 silent guests. Somewhere behind me, a champagne glass clinked against a plate. Someone laughed nervously. My future mother-in-law stood near the ballroom stage with one manicured hand pressed dramatically against her pearls, staring at the blood smeared across my sleeves like I'd dragged a corpse into her precious gala. I knew she would embarrass this family, she hissed. I opened my mouth to explain, but Richard Whitmore pointed toward the doors before I could speak. "Get her out, right now." The taller guard tightened his grip on my elbow. My shoulder ached from where I'd smashed through a car window less than an hour earlier. My hands still smelled like gasoline and blood. And then the ballroom doors swung open. A woman in a black cashmere coat stormed inside, rain blowing in behind her. Her face was pale with panic. The entire room recognized her instantly. Victoria Hale, one of the wealthiest women in Boston. And the moment her eyes landed on me, everything changed. "That woman," she said, her voice breaking, "that woman saved my granddaughter's life." 3 hours earlier, before the blood and humiliation and silence, I had been sitting alone in my car, trying to convince myself not to turn around. The windshield wipers pushed sheets of rain aside in uneven rhythms, while downtown Boston blurred under yellow streetlights. My fingers rested against the steering wheel, stiff from old injuries that never fully healed after Afghanistan. I could still hear Daniel's voice from earlier that afternoon. "Please come tonight, Evelyn. Just give them one more chance." One more chance. I almost laughed thinking about it. Richard and Margaret Whitmore had spent the last 2 years making it painfully clear I wasn't the woman they wanted marrying their son. It didn't matter that I was a captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. It didn't matter that I'd spent years patching shattered bodies together in field hospitals, while their country club friends debated golf memberships over lobster bisque. To them, I was still the daughter of a mechanic from Ohio who sometimes forgot which fork to use at formal dinners. Margaret once smiled directly at me over tea and said, "Military women always seem so hardened. I suppose war changes femininity." Another time, Richard asked if I planned to keep playing soldier after marrying Daniel. Playing soldier? I had been 27 years old when I held pressure against a 19-year-old private's chest, while mortars exploded less than 50 yards away. I remembered the smell of burning sandbags, the sound of someone screaming for morphine, the warm blood soaking through my gloves while that kid begged me to tell his mother he was brave. But according to Richard Whitmore, I was playing soldier. My phone buzzed through the center console. "Daniel." I stared at it for a second before answering through Bluetooth. "Hey, you're still coming, right?" he asked carefully. I could hear voices behind him, music, crystal glasses. The gala had already started. "I'm on my way." He exhaled softly, relieved. "Thank you." I waited. Part of me wanted him to say something else, something stronger. Something like, "If they disrespect you tonight, we leave together." But Daniel had spent his whole life smoothing tension instead of confronting it. "They're just stressed," he said quietly. "My father's company's under pressure right now." "That doesn't excuse cruelty." "I know," his voice softened. "I just want tonight to go well." I stared through the rain-smeared windshield. So do I. After we hung up, I drove another 20 minutes through worsening weather. Thunder rolled low over the harbor. Traffic crawled near the financial district. Headlights reflected off flooded pavement in long silver streaks. That was when I saw the SUV. At first, it looked like a dark shape against the guardrail. Then lightning flashed overhead and I realized the vehicle was tilted halfway into a drainage ditch. Hazard lights blinked weakly through the rain. Training takes over before emotion does. People think heroism feels dramatic in the moment. It doesn't. It feels procedural, controlled. Your body moves before fear catches up. I pulled onto the shoulder and grabbed the trauma kit I kept in my trunk out of habit. The cold rain hit my face instantly as I ran toward the wreck. The front windshield was shattered. The driver, a woman maybe in her 30s, was slumped unconscious over the steering wheel. Airbags hung limp inside the cabin. And then I heard it. A child choking. I ran to the rear passenger side and saw a little girl strapped into her seat, convulsing violently. Oh God. Blood trickled down the side of her forehead. "Hey, sweetheart, stay with me," I said immediately, forcing calm into my voice. The rear door was jammed shut. I grabbed a tire iron from the muddy ground near the crash and smashed the side window hard enough that pain shot through my wrist. Glass exploded inward. The child screamed. It's okay, I'm here." Rain soaked through my dress within seconds as I climbed halfway into the vehicle. The smell inside was overwhelming: gasoline-deployed airbags, blood-burnt rubber. The girl's seizure worsened. I checked her airway first. Still breathing. Barely. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered. My hands moved automatically steady despite the adrenaline flooding my chest. Tilt the head, monitor the pupils, keep her from aspirating, control bleeding, stabilize the neck as much as possible. The little girl couldn't have been older than 8. And suddenly, for one terrible second, she reminded me of my younger sister back home. Same dark curls, same frightened eyes. The child stopped moving. My stomach dropped. No, stay with me. I checked for breathing again. Weak. Too weak. I leaned closer, listening over the pounding rain and distant thunder while my own pulse hammered in my ears. Far away, sirens finally echoed through the storm. But I already knew those next few minutes would matter more than anything waiting for me at that gala. The little girl's lips had started turning blue by the time the ambulance finally reached us. Rain hammered against the overturned SUV so hard it sounded like gravel pouring from the sky. My knees were buried in cold mud beside the vehicle, and my entire body shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. One of my sleeves had ripped open on shattered glass, leaving a long cut across my forearm that I hadn't even noticed until blood mixed with the rainwater running down my hand. But none of that mattered. The only thing I could focus on was the child. "Stay with me, sweetheart," I kept saying softly while supporting her airway. "You're doing good. Just keep breathing for me." Her name was Lily. I'd learned that from the pink backpack crushed near the floorboard. There was a little stuffed rabbit hanging from the zipper soaked through with rainwater. The seizure finally eased, but her breathing remained shallow and irregular. One of the paramedics rushed over carrying equipment through the storm. "What do we have?" "Female, approximately 8 years old," I answered immediately. "Vehicle rollover, head trauma. Active seizure activity for at least 2 minutes when I arrived. Possible concussion, brief respiratory collapse." The medic looked at me sharply, instantly recognizing military precision in the way I spoke. "You medical?" "Army trauma." He nodded once. No more questions needed. The unconscious driver, the child's nanny, I later learned was extracted from the front seat while firefighters cut through twisted metal. Sirens painted the rain in flashes of red and blue. Steam hissed from the SUV's crushed engine. The little girl suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to find my face. "Don't leave," she whispered weakly. Something inside my chest tightened painfully. "I'm right here." She held on while the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher. Even after they secured oxygen around her face, her fingers refused to let go of my sleeve. One of the medics gave me a sympathetic look. "You can ride with us if you're family." I almost said yes, but then my phone vibrated again. "Daniel." I looked toward the ambulance, toward the frightened little girl staring at me through the oxygen mask, then toward the glowing Boston skyline beyond the rain. Duty pulls people in different directions. Sometimes there's no right answer, only the choice you can live with afterward. I leaned down beside Lily one last time. "You're safe now," I told her gently. "These people are going to take care of you." Her small hand finally loosened from my sleeve. I stood in the rain watching the ambulance disappear into traffic before realizing what I looked like. My cream-colored evening dress was ruined. Blood streaked across the fabric from my chest to my knees. Mud splattered the hem. My hair had completely fallen loose from its pins, sticking damply to my face and neck. And I was already over an hour late. I should have gone home. Honestly, I almost did. But Daniel had begged me to come. And despite everything his parents thought about me, some stubborn part of me still believed maybe tonight could be different. Maybe people could surprise you. By the time I arrived at the Whitmore Gala, valet attendants stood beneath massive white awnings outside the Fairmont Copley Plaza, while luxury cars lined the entrance in glittering rows. Men in tuxedos and women wrapped in diamonds moved through the lobby beneath crystal chandeliers glowing gold against polished marble floors. The second I stepped out of my car, the valet froze. His eyes widened at the blood on my dress. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I answered quickly. "Long story." The young man looked unconvinced but handed me my ticket silently. Inside, the hotel warmth hit my skin immediately. The scent of expensive perfume champagne and fresh roses floated through the lobby. Somewhere nearby, a string quartet played softly. I caught my reflection briefly in one of the mirrored walls and almost stopped walking. I looked horrifying. There was dried blood on my collarbone. My mascara had washed halfway down my cheeks from the storm. One side of my dress clung darkly to my skin where rainwater hadn't dried yet. People stared as I crossed the lobby, some with concern, others with disgust. The ballroom doors stood open ahead of me, glowing with warm light and laughter. I took one steadying breath and walked inside. The room fell silent almost immediately. It happened in waves. First, the people nearest the entrance noticed me. Then conversations began fading table by table until the entire ballroom slowly quieted beneath the soft music. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. A waiter nearly dropped a tray of champagne glasses. At the far end of the room, Margaret Whitmore stood near the stage in a silver designer gown, surrounded by donors and investors. Richard Whitmore was beside her, laughing at something one of the board members had said. Then they saw me. Margaret's smile vanished instantly. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Daniel started toward me from across the ballroom, concern flashing across his face. "Evelyn." But his mother reached me first. "Oh my God," she whispered sharply, staring at my dress. "What on earth happened to you?" "I stopped at an accident," I began calmly. "There was a little girl hurt and—" Margaret glanced around at the horrified guests before cutting me off. "You came here looking like this." The humiliation hit harder than I expected. Not because of what she said. Because I suddenly realized she wasn't worried about whether I was hurt. She was worried about the party. "I didn't have time to change," I answered quietly. Richard approached beside her, jaw tight with fury. "You're covered in blood." "Yes," I said evenly, "because a child almost died tonight." A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, but Margaret lowered her voice and hissed, "Couldn't you have handled this privately? We have senators here, investors, reporters." I stared at her. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't find words. Daniel finally reached us. "Mom, stop." "No," Margaret snapped. "Look at her. This is exactly the kind of chaos I warned you about." Chaos. Not bravery. Not compassion. Not sacrifice. Chaos. Richard's face hardened as more guests continued staring openly now. "You've embarrassed this family enough," he said coldly. Something inside me went very still. I thought about the child's tiny fingers gripping my sleeve in the ambulance. I thought about Afghanistan. About boys bleeding out in desert tents while helicopters shook the ground beneath us. And suddenly this ballroom with its diamonds and champagne and shallow cruelty felt impossibly small. "I saved a little girl tonight," I said quietly. Margaret folded her arms. "And now you're making a spectacle of yourself." Daniel looked trapped between us, panic rising behind his eyes. "Dad, please." But Richard turned toward security near the entrance. "Escort her out." Daniel froze. That was the moment something in me finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. Because the man I loved didn't move. He didn't stand beside me. He didn't say, "If she leaves, I leave too." He just stood there. Two security guards approached carefully. One reached for my arm. "I can walk myself," I said. The ballroom had become unbearably quiet now, except for the soft clinking of silverware somewhere near the back tables. And then the doors opened. Wind rushed inside from the storm outside. A tall woman in a black coat entered with two suited bodyguards behind her. Rain glistened across her shoulders. Every wealthy person in that ballroom recognized her instantly. Victoria Hale. Conversation stopped completely. Her expression was pale with panic as she scanned the room desperately. Then her eyes landed on me, on the blood covering my dress, and suddenly her face crumpled with emotion. "That's her," she said, voice shaking. "That's the woman who saved Lily." For 3 full seconds, nobody in that ballroom moved. The security guard still had one hand lightly around my arm, though his grip loosened almost immediately. Margaret Whitmore looked like someone had drained the color from her body. Richard's expression hardened into confusion first, then calculation. But Victoria Hale never looked at either of them. She walked straight toward me. The room parted for her automatically. That kind of power doesn't need to announce itself. People feel it before a word is spoken. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. I suddenly became aware of how exhausted I was. My shoulders hurt. My knees still stung from kneeling on broken asphalt. Blood had dried stiff against my skin beneath the ballroom lights. I could smell smoke and rain lingering on my clothes among all the perfume and polished wealth surrounding me. Victoria stopped directly in front of me. Up close, she looked older than she did in magazines. Not weaker, just real. The kind of woman grief had carved into something sharper and quieter over the years. Her eyes filled as she looked at the blood on my sleeves. "You stayed with her," she whispered. I nodded once. She was scared. Victoria pressed trembling fingers against her mouth for a moment, like she was trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. Then, to everyone's shock, she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around me. The ballroom erupted into stunned murmurs. "Oh my God. That's Victoria Hale." She hugged her. My body froze from surprise before I slowly returned the embrace. I could feel her shaking slightly. "My granddaughter is alive because of you," she said against my shoulder. Across the room, I saw Richard Whitmore's entire posture change. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Because every person in Boston's upper financial circles knew Hale Capital had been quietly reviewing Whitmore Development for a massive investment deal. Rumors about Whitmore's debt problems had circulated for months. And now the woman holding their future in her hands was standing in the middle of their gala, hugging the woman they had just publicly humiliated. Victoria finally pulled back and looked at my injured arm. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing serious. You should be at a hospital." I almost laughed softly at that. Occupational hazard. Her eyes narrowed slightly as though she recognized something familiar in my tone. One of her security men stepped closer. "Ma'am, the doctors are asking for you back at Mass General." Victoria nodded distractedly without taking her eyes off me. "How is Lily?" "Stable, sedated for observation." A visible wave of relief crossed her face. Margaret suddenly stepped forward, wearing the brittle smile wealthy people use when they're terrified. "Victoria," she said carefully, "we had no idea Evelyn was involved in all this." Victoria turned slowly toward her. And for the first time since entering the ballroom, her expression became cold. "No," she said quietly, "I don't believe you did." Silence spread again. Margaret tried another smile. "We were simply concerned for the guests. She arrived in such an alarming condition." "Covered in my granddaughter's blood," Victoria replied. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. I stood there emotionally detached now, almost outside myself. Adrenaline exhaustion does strange things to the brain. Sounds become distant, faces blur around the edges. I noticed tiny details instead. The condensation sliding down untouched champagne glasses. The faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to Richard's tuxedo. Daniel standing 6 feet away looking sick with shame. Victoria turned back toward me. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Carter." Ms. Carter, the neurosurgeon, told me another 5 or 6 minutes without intervention could have killed Lily. The room grew even quieter somehow. I looked down briefly. I just did what anyone should do. "No," Victoria said immediately. "Most people drive past." That line landed heavily because everyone there knew it was true. Especially them. Richard Whitmore finally stepped forward, attempting composure. "Victoria, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private." Her eyes shifted toward him with surgical precision. "You called security on her." Richard hesitated. There was clearly a misunderstanding. "No," Victoria said, "there wasn't." Her voice never rose, that made it worse. "I walked in here and saw 2 guards removing a woman who had just saved a child's life, while your guests stood around staring at her like she was trash on the bottom of their shoes." Nobody breathed. Margaret glanced nervously toward the surrounding investors, now pretending not to listen. Victoria continued calmly. "Do you know what Lily told the paramedics before they sedated her?" I shook my head slightly. She said, "The army lady stayed because she didn't want me to die alone." Something cracked open painfully inside my chest. For a second, Afghanistan flashed through my mind again. A 19-year-old Marine gripping my hand under dim emergency lights. Please don't leave me, ma'am. Some memories never stop breathing. Victoria studied my face carefully, then asked quietly, You served overseas? Yes. Army. Medical Corps. Her expression shifted. My son was 1st Battalion Marines, she said softly. Fallujah, then Helmand Province. I saw it instantly then that look military families recognize in one another without explanation, the permanent grief hidden beneath polished surfaces. He died 11 years ago. I'm sorry, I said gently. Victoria nodded once. They told me he died protecting 2 younger soldiers during an evacuation. The ballroom around us had disappeared completely now. No music, no chatter, just silence and the sound of rain against distant windows. My son used to talk about Army medics constantly, she continued quietly. Said they were the bravest people he ever saw because they ran towards suffering instead of away from it. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Across the room, Daniel looked at me differently now. Not as his fiancée caught in another conflict with his parents, but almost like he was seeing the full shape of my life for the first time. And somehow that hurt more. Victoria finally turned back toward Richard Whitmore. You know, she said calmly, I spent the drive here preparing to thank whoever saved Lily. Richard swallowed visibly. But instead, she continued, I arrived just in time to watch you humiliate her. No one moved. Then Victoria looked around the ballroom slowly, her gaze settling over the glittering tables, crystal chandeliers, and silent, wealthy guests. Incredible, she murmured. Hundreds of successful people in this room, and the only person here tonight with genuine character is the woman you tried to throw out. Margaret's face crumpled slightly. Daniel opened his mouth finally, Evelyn I. But I looked at him and whatever he saw in my expression stopped him cold. Because love can survive many things, but not standing alone while someone decides your worth in front of a room full of strangers. Victoria gently touched my injured sleeve again. Come with me, she said softly. You shouldn't spend another minute here. And for the first time all evening, the entire ballroom stepped aside to let me pass. The rain had slowed to a cold mist by the time Victoria Hale and I stepped into the private lounge adjoining the ballroom. The noise from the gala faded behind thick mahogany doors, replaced by the soft crackling of a fireplace and the muted hum of downtown traffic beyond the windows. Someone from hotel staff brought towels and a first aid kit without being asked. Wealth like Victoria's moved the world quietly. Doors opened before requests were spoken. I sat carefully on the edge of a leather chair while she poured 2 glasses of water with steady hands that still trembled ever so slightly beneath the surface. Your arm, she said? It looks worse than it is. That's what military people always say. There was dry humor in her voice now, but grief still lingered behind it. She handed me the glass and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could finally feel the exhaustion settling into my bones now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. My hands ached. My back hurt. And underneath all of it sat the hollow disappointment Daniel had left behind in that ballroom. Victoria broke the silence first. You love my granddaughter already, she said quietly. I blinked. I met her an hour ago. No, she replied gently. You protected her. There's a difference. I looked down at the bloodstains on my ruined dress. When children are scared, I said softly, they remember who stayed calm. Victoria watched me carefully for a second before asking, How long have the Whitmores treated you like that? I gave a tired smile. Long enough. She leaned back slowly. Richard Whitmore once spent 20 minutes lecturing a waiter at a charity dinner because the wine arrived late. That surprised a quiet laugh out of me despite everything. Victoria's expression hardened again. People tell you exactly who they are when they think money protects them from consequences. A knock interrupted us. One of Victoria's assistants entered carrying a tablet and several folders. Ma'am, the board members from Hale Capital are asking whether tomorrow's Whitmore meeting is still happening. Victoria didn't even hesitate. Number. The assistant nodded immediately. Understood. He disappeared again. I stared at her, that fast. Victoria met my eyes directly. Evelyn, I do business with people whose judgment I trust. Tonight, I watched Richard Whitmore publicly degrade the woman who saved a child's life because she threatened his image. Her tone stayed calm. That somehow made the words feel heavier. That tells me everything I need to know about how he treats people when cameras aren't watching. Back inside the ballroom, faint music resumed awkwardly through the walls. Someone was trying desperately to salvage the evening. Victoria shook her head slightly. They built their reputation on philanthropy and family values. Boston society loves that performance. She paused. But real character appears when something inconvenient walks through the door. I thought about Daniel then. About the way he'd frozen. The memory hurt more now than Richard or Margaret ever could. Victoria noticed my silence. You're thinking about him. Yes. And I took a long breath. I think Daniel loves me, I admitted quietly, but I also think he's spent his entire life surviving his parents instead of confronting them. Victoria nodded slowly like she understood that kind of family too well. My husband came from old political money, she said, the kind that teaches children obedience before self-respect. Outside the lounge windows, headlights crawled through wet city streets below us. When my son enlisted, she continued softly, his grandfather called him a disgrace to the family. I looked up. Victoria smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in it. Funny how powerful men panic when someone chooses service over status. That line settled deep inside me. Because she understood. Not just the military. The loneliness that sometimes came with it. A second knock sounded. This time it was Daniel. Victoria glanced at me before quietly standing. I'll give you a moment. She walked past him without expression and closed the door behind her. Daniel remained near the entrance for several seconds, looking wrecked. His bow tie hung loose now. His face had lost all color. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I was too tired to pretend his apology fixed anything. Daniel stepped closer carefully. Evelyn, I didn't know what to do. The words hit harder than shouting would have. I looked at him quietly. That was the problem. Pain flashed across his face. They blindsided me. No, I replied softly. They've treated me this way for 2 years. He looked down. And there it was. Truth. Not cruelty, not malice, just weakness. The kind that destroys people slowly because it waits too long to become courage. I love you, he whispered. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes, then not because I doubted him, but because I believed him. And sometimes love alone still isn't enough. You stood there while they had security drag me out, I said quietly. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. I was trying to stop things from escalating. I almost smiled sadly at that. That's what you've always done, Daniel. You manage tension, you smooth things over, you survive your parents. I looked directly at him. But someday you have to decide whether you're a son first or a man first. He looked shattered. And part of me hated causing that expression because despite everything, Daniel wasn't a bad person. He was simply raised inside a system where keeping peace mattered more than defending truth. The ballroom doors burst open somewhere in the distance then. Raised voices echoed faintly through the hallway. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Victoria just informed my father she's pulling out of the investment deal. I said nothing. She also told 3 board members exactly why. There it was. The real collapse beginning. Whitmore Development had quietly been bleeding money for over a year due to over-leveraged luxury projects. Hale Capital's backing would have stabilized everything. Without it, I already knew what would happen. Investors panic fast when confidence disappears. Daniel sat heavily across from me, suddenly looking much older than 38. My father's going to blame you. No, I said quietly. He's going to blame himself, eventually. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked the question both of us already knew the answer to. Is this over? The fireplace crackled softly between us. I thought about every dinner where I'd swallowed humiliation to keep peace. Every backhanded comment Margaret disguised as sophistication. Every moment Daniel almost defended me but stopped halfway. Then I remembered a frightened little girl gripping my sleeve in the rain asking me not to leave her alone. And somehow that child had shown me more clarity in one night than this relationship had given me in 2 years. I slowly slipped the engagement ring from my finger. Daniel's face crumpled instantly. I wanted you to choose me without hesitation, I whispered. The ring rested cold and heavy in my palm. But you never did. 3 weeks after the gala, I stood in full dress uniform beneath soft autumn sunlight, outside the Hale Foundation Center for Military Families, while volunteers carried donation boxes through the courtyard behind me. The air smelled like coffee-fallen leaves and fresh paint. Construction crews were still finishing one side of the building, but inside the counseling offices were already open for veterans and military children. Life moves strangely after public humiliation. At first there's silence, then whispers, then consequences. By Monday morning, clips from the Whitmore Gala had spread across social media after one of the guests leaked cell phone footage of Richard ordering security to remove me. By Tuesday, Boston news outlets were running stories about the Army captain who saved a child before being thrown out of a millionaire gala. People love scandals involving rich families. But what truly damaged the Whitmores wasn't the embarrassment. It was the contrast. A blood-covered military officer who stopped to save a child, versus wealthy philanthropists worried about table linens and appearances. That kind of story sticks to people, especially older Americans who still understand what service means. Whitmore Development lost 2 investors within 10 days. One board member resigned quietly. Another demanded Richard step down as acting chairman until reputational concerns stabilized. The newspapers called it unfortunate timing. But everyone in Boston knew the truth. Character had finally become expensive. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since the night I returned the ring. Not because I hated him. Oddly enough, hatred would have been easier. Instead, I missed him in small, painful ways that arrived unexpectedly. Hearing jazz music in restaurants he would have liked. Passing bookstores we used to wander through on quiet Sundays. Reaching for my phone before remembering there was no reason to call anymore. Some endings happen all at once. Others echo for months. Victoria Hale found me 2 days after the gala sitting alone at a diner near the VA hospital wearing sweatpants and drinking terrible coffee after a 14-hour shift. No makeup. Hair tied back. Emotionally exhausted. She slid into the booth across from me wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my first car and said, "You look exactly like my son used to after back-to-back rotations." Then she ordered pancakes for both of us without asking. That was the beginning. Now, weeks later, she stood near the foundation entrance speaking with donors, while Lily chased Bubbles across the courtyard with several other military kids. The scar near Lily's hairline had mostly healed. Every so often she glanced over at me just to make sure I was still there. Trauma does that to children. Truthfully, it does it to adults too. "Captain Carter." I turned to see one of the volunteers approaching. "We're ready for the opening remarks." I nodded once. As I started toward the podium, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the edge of the parking lot. Daniel. For one suspended moment, neither of us moved. He looked thinner than I remembered. Tired. The kind of tired money can't hide. Victoria noticed him too, but wisely said nothing as she walked inside with the others. Daniel approached slowly after the crowd disappeared into the building. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I wasn't sure either." A sad smile flickered across his face. The wind stirred fallen leaves across the pavement between us. "How's your father?" I asked quietly. Daniel let out a breath through his nose. Angry, humiliated, looking for someone to blame. "And your mother?" "She still thinks this whole thing was a misunderstanding." That almost made me laugh. Almost. Daniel shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I moved out. I looked at him carefully then. "You finally stood up to them." Too late. Neither of us argued with that. For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant traffic and children laughing inside the foundation building. "I loved you," he said finally. The honesty in his voice hurt. Because I believed him completely. "I know. And I should have protected you." I swallowed slowly. "Yes," I answered softly, "you should have." His eyes reddened slightly, though he held himself together. "I kept thinking if I could balance everyone long enough, eventually they'd accept you." He shook his head bitterly. "I didn't realize asking you to tolerate disrespect was its own kind of betrayal." That line settled heavily between us. Growth often arrives wrapped in regret. I stepped closer then, not romantically, not cruelly either. Just honestly. "You were raised to keep peace at any cost," I said. "But peace without integrity becomes cowardice eventually." Daniel nodded once like he'd already learned that lesson the hard way. "I'm trying to become better than them." I hope you do. He looked at me for another long moment before asking quietly, could there ever be another chance? There it was. The question both of us already knew the answer to. Behind us, I could hear Lily laughing inside the building. Victoria's voice floated faintly through the open doors. Somewhere above the city church bells rang noon across Boston. I smiled sadly. Some people come into our lives forever, I said softly. Others come into our lives to change us. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then, after a long silence, he nodded. Take care of yourself, Evelyn. You too. He walked away slowly across the parking lot without looking back again. And strangely, watching him leave no longer felt like losing something. It felt like surviving something. An hour later, the Foundation auditorium filled with veterans, spouses, social workers, donors, and military families, balancing restless children on their laps. I stood at the podium in uniform while sunlight streamed through tall windows behind the audience. Victoria sat in the front row beside Lily. In her hands rested an old photograph. After the ceremony, she showed it to me privately in her office. A young Marine smiling beside a dusty Humvee somewhere overseas. Her son. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Victoria touched the photo gently. After he died, I spent years surrounded by powerful people pretending influence mattered most. She looked up at me. Then you walked into that ballroom covered in blood from saving a child. Tears burned behind my eyes. You reminded me what real honor looks like. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Lily burst into the office holding construction paper stars and immediately wrapped herself around my waist. Look what I made. I laughed softly through the emotion and crouched beside her. And in that moment, surrounded by sunlight and laughter and imperfect healing, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. The richest people in the world are not the ones who protect their status. They're the ones who still protect others after life gives them every reason not to. If this story moved you, I'd truly love to hear where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. Stories like this remind us that dignity, courage, and kindness still matter, especially in a world obsessed with appearances. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and unexpected justice, make sure you subscribe and join us for the next journey. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. My father didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. He had a way of cutting through a room with a sentence so clean it left no blood on the floor, just silence. But that morning in courtroom 11C, he didn't bother with precision. She never served. He said, each word sharpened by something close to contempt. She stole our name. Every bit of it is a lie. The sound didn't echo. It landed. People turned, not slowly, all at once. A ripple of heads' eyes pens pausing mid-note. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath like they'd been waiting for exactly that line. I didn't look at him. I looked at the bench. At the woman seated above us in a dark robe, her posture still her gaze unreadable. Judge Marion Vale had been quiet all morning. Not indifferent, there's a difference, but contained like someone holding a door closed against a storm no one else could hear. I didn't flinch, I didn't speak, I just watched her. And I waited. Because something in the way her eyes settled on me just for a fraction longer than necessary felt less like judgment and more like recognition. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper that had been handled too many times. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a thin electric buzz that never quite disappeared even when people spoke. The air was cold in that institutional way, as if warmth had been deliberately engineered out of it. 6 feet separated me from the people who gave me life. On the plaintiff's side, Daniel Whitmore, my father. Immaculate as always. Navy suit, crisp, white shirt, tie, knotted with practiced ease. His hair was silver now, but controlled combed back in a way that suggested discipline rather than age. Beside him sat my mother Evelyn. Pearl earrings, neutral expression, the same posture she used at charity luncheons, board meetings, funerals, appropriate, contained, untouchable. Their attorney stood just slightly forward, a man with coastal polish, and the easy confidence of someone who believed the story he was telling was already halfway to being accepted as truth. On the defense side, my side, there was only me. No stack of documents, no legal team flanking me, no carefully tabbed binders. Just a charcoal coat, my hair pulled back tight, and my hands folded in my lap so they wouldn't give away the small, involuntary tremor that lived somewhere beneath my skin. My uniform wasn't with me. It was folded at home, pressed clean, tucked inside a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. But I could still feel it, the weight of it, the seam of the shoulder patch that had once sat against my arm, the faint ghost of sand that never quite left your memory no matter how many times you washed. Kandahar had a smell, dust and heat and something metallic that clung to the back of your throat. That scent never really leaves you. Even here. Even now. The bailiff called the case again, voice steady practiced, Whitmore versus Whitmore. A pause followed, not long, just long enough for the absurdity of it to settle in the room. My father leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on the table as if anchoring himself to something solid. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, but it hadn't softened. She's built an entire life on a fabrication, he said. Military service that never happened, records that don't exist, benefits she had no right to claim. She has used our name, my name, to give credibility to a lie. His lawyer picked up the thread smoothly. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the defendant has knowingly misrepresented herself as a United States Army officer. We will show that there is no verifiable record of her enlistment under her Social Security number in any publicly accessible Department of Defense database. We will show financial records. Paper slid across the table, a soft, deliberate sound, indicating she has received veteran-related benefits over a period of several years. We will also present witness testimony suggesting a pattern of unstable behavior and attention-seeking narratives consistent with fabricated trauma. The words were clinical, clean. They had been chosen carefully. Unstable, fabricated, attention-seeking. Each one placed exactly where it would do the most damage. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Silence, I had learned, unsettles people more than argument. It forces them to sit with what they've said instead of pushing against resistance. But to them, my silence meant something else. Guilt. Confession. Proof. I could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way a reporter in the second row tilted her head, pen poised, as if she'd already decided which version of the story would be easier to write. Because on paper, my father's version made sense. On paper, I didn't exist. I was 18 when I left that house. Barely an adult. My head shaved down to something that felt more like a statement than a haircut. I remember standing in the doorway with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. A hug, maybe. Or at least acknowledgement. My mother stood in the kitchen, her back partially turned, as if the angle itself could soften the moment into something less significant. My father didn't get up from his chair. "Just don't embarrass us," he said, not looking away from the paper in his hands. That was it. No ceremony, no pride, no question about where I was going or why. I told myself it didn't matter. That I was stepping into something bigger than that house, bigger than their approval. That one day I would come back with something they couldn't dismiss. I didn't understand then that dismissal wasn't about evidence. It was about willingness. And my father had never been willing to see me as anything other than a deviation from the version of a daughter he found acceptable. "Miss Whitmore," the judge's voice cut gently through the room, bringing me back. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. "You've chosen to represent yourself in this matter." "Yes, ma'am." A slight nod, no judgment in it, just acknowledgement. "And you understand the nature of the allegations being made against you?" "I do." Another pause. She studied me then. Not the way the others had, scanning for weakness, for cracks, but as if she were placing something, aligning it with a memory just out of reach. "Very well," she said finally. "We'll proceed." The prosecution continued. More documents, more language designed to sound definitive. No photographic evidence of service. No discharge papers available for independent verification. No commanding officer willing to come forward under her name. Each point landed like a nail being driven into something already assumed to be true. They were building a picture. A woman who had come back from nowhere with stories no one could confirm. A daughter who had always been difficult, now seeking validation through something dramatic enough to command attention. My father didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his gaze forward, his jaw set in that familiar line that used to mean he was disappointed. Now it meant something else. Determination. He believed this. Or maybe belief wasn't the right word. He had decided it was true. And that was enough. During a brief recess, I allowed myself a glance in his direction. He was sipping water from a clear bottle, his posture relaxed, almost satisfied. My mother leaned in slightly, whispering something I couldn't hear. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. They looked like a couple waiting for a verdict they were confident would go their way. As if this were routine. As if erasing me were just another item on a list of necessary corrections. I looked away first, not because I couldn't hold his gaze, but because I no longer needed to. When the session resumed, their attorney stepped forward again, his voice carrying easily. Your Honor, if the defendant truly served, there would be verifiable evidence. A unit, a record, a chain of command willing to confirm her claims. But instead we have silence. He turned just enough to gesture in my direction without fully facing me. We have a narrative unsupported by fact. We have myth. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but present. I felt it, the shift. The weight of assumption settling into place. I didn't respond. I just lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale had gone very still. Her fingers rested against the wood unmoving. Her gaze wasn't on the attorney anymore. It was on me. Not questioning. Not skeptical. Something else. Something older than this room. Slower. Heavier. As if somewhere beneath the layers of procedure and distance, she had just recognized a detail that didn't belong to a story, but to a memory. And for the first time since my father had opened his mouth that morning, I felt something shift. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the space between what was being said and what had actually happened. I held her gaze. And I waited. Because if there was one thing I had learned both in that house and far beyond it, it was this. Truth doesn't always arrive when it's called. But when it does, it doesn't ask permission. I learned early that in my father's house, affection wasn't given, it was earned, itemized, and quietly withdrawn when it no longer served a purpose. There were rules, though no one ever wrote them down. You didn't ask questions that made people uncomfortable. You didn't contradict him in front of others. You didn't choose a path that reflected poorly on the name he had spent decades polishing. And above all, you didn't become something he couldn't explain. My brother Mason understood that instinctively. He moved through life like a well-rehearsed answer. Varsity letters, easy smile, a business degree from Duke that my father mentioned in conversations the way other people referenced weather casually, but often enough that everyone remembered. Mason knew how to be seen. I knew how to notice. Which in my father's world were not the same thing. I was the one who read too much, asked too many questions, and never quite mastered the art of softening my edges for other people's comfort. In family photos, I stood where I was told, but I didn't lean in. I didn't perform closeness, I didn't feel. That alone was enough to mark me as difficult. By the time I was 16, the gap between what my father expected and who I actually was had widened into something unspoken but permanent. He stopped correcting me, stopped advising, stopped trying. It wasn't acceptance. It was disengagement. When I enlisted, he called it a phase. Rebellion has a way of burning itself out, he told one of his colleagues over dinner, as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. She'll come back to something more. Appropriate. Appropriate. It was his favorite word for anything that fit inside his understanding of the world. The Army didn't. I didn't enlist to prove him wrong. Not exactly. I enlisted because it was the first thing that felt real, something that didn't depend on his approval or his interpretation, something with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away over a polite conversation. Basic training stripped everything down. Name, hair, habits, assumptions. What was left was simpler, harder, more honest. There's a clarity in being pushed past your limits by people who don't care who your father is. No one there knew the Whitmore name. No one cared. For the first time, that felt like relief. The first deployment came faster than I expected. Kandahar wasn't what people imagine when they hear it spoken from a distance. It wasn't a single place. It was layers of dust and heat and tension that never fully dissipated. The air itself felt alert, as if it were waiting for something to break. I wasn't infantry. I wasn't leading patrols through villages or clearing buildings. I was attached to a medical evacuation unit operating in coordination with routes that didn't appear on standard maps. Our job was simple in theory: get in, stabilize, get out. In practice, it meant arriving at the worst moments of someone else's day. Sometimes of their life. You don't remember every face. You can't. Your mind learns to protect itself in ways you don't notice until later. But you remember details, a voice, a hand gripping yours too tightly, the way someone says your name when they're trying not to panic. You remember the wait. Always the wait. The night everything changed didn't announce itself. Convoys don't come with warnings. They come with routine, repetition, the false comfort of doing something enough times that it starts to feel predictable. We were 3 vehicles deep when the blast hit. The sound was wrong, not louder than expected, just closer, immediate in a way that bypassed thought and went straight to reaction. Training took over. Movement, assessment, triage. There was no time to process anything beyond what was in front of you, no space for fear. That came later if it came at all. I remember the heat first, then the smell burnt metal, something sharper underneath it. Someone shouting coordinates, someone else calling out for a medic who wasn't answering. And then I was moving. Hands on a body, pressure where there was too much blood, instructions I didn't remember forming leaving my mouth like they had been waiting there all along. Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Look at me. I said those things to strangers, to people whose names I didn't know, whose lives I would never see beyond that moment. But that night one of those faces stayed. Not because it was different, because of what came after. I didn't talk about Kandahar when I came home. Not because I didn't want to, because there was nowhere for it to go. You can't place that kind of experience into a room where people are discussing dinner plans and social calendars. It doesn't fit. It sits there heavy and out of place until someone changes the subject or pretends it was never brought up. So I learned not to bring it up. 3 years passed before I returned home for more than a few days at a time. By then, the fractures had settled into something stable, predictable. I arrived with a duffel bag, a letter of commendation, and a bronze star tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. I didn't lead with any of it. I knocked on the door like a guest. My mother answered. She looked at me through the peephole first. I could hear the faint shift of weight on the other side before the door opened halfway. "Oh," she said, "you're back." No surprise, no relief, just acknowledgement. I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, lemon cleaner, something baked earlier in the day, the quiet hum of central air. My father was in the living room seated in his usual chair. He looked up briefly. "Do you still have health insurance?" he asked. That was his first question. Not where I had been, not what had happened. Logistics. Practicalities. Things he could categorize and resolve. I stood there for a moment waiting for something else to follow. It didn't. I stayed a week. Long enough to confirm what I had already suspected. Nothing in that house had shifted to accommodate who I had become. There was no space for it, no curiosity, no attempt to reconcile the version of me they had held onto with the person standing in front of them. At dinner, conversations flowed around me. Mason's new job, a charity event my mother was organizing, a colleague of my father's who had recently published something worth reading. No one asked about the army. Not directly. Not indirectly. It was as if that part of my life existed behind glass, visible perhaps, but not something they were willing to touch. After a while, I stopped expecting them to. When I moved out, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no ultimatum. Just a quiet decision made over coffee in the early morning, the kind where the light comes in through the window at an angle that makes everything feel temporarily clear. I found a small studio near the river. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, but it was mine. I volunteered at a trauma clinic that didn't ask for explanations. They didn't need them. The people who came through those doors carried their own versions of silence. There was an understanding there that didn't require translation. Through a legal aid group, I filed for veteran benefits. It wasn't straightforward. Parts of my service record had been processed through channels that didn't align cleanly with civilian databases. There were notations, flags, references to classifications I didn't have clearance to revisit. But eventually, with enough documentation and enough patience, the system recognized what it needed to. Or at least enough of it. I didn't push further. I wasn't looking for recognition. Just stability. The letter arrived on a gray morning in January. Certified mail. My name written in a hand I recognized immediately. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, the envelope still sealed something tight forming in my chest that I couldn't quite name. When I opened it, the language was exactly what I expected. Formal, precise, distant. Daniel Whitmore versus Elena Whitmore. The claim was laid out in clean, structured paragraphs. Accusations of fraud, identity misrepresentation, unauthorized receipt of benefits, damage to family reputation. It read less like a father addressing his daughter and more like a man correcting a public record. I sat down at the small kitchen table and read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, because part of me still believed there had to be something I was missing. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication. Something that could be resolved with a conversation. But there was no invitation to talk. No request for clarification. Just a summons. He hadn't just chosen not to see me. He had chosen to define me. In a way that made my existence inconvenient. And then he had decided to remove that inconvenience. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. I didn't feel anger right away. That came later. What I felt first was something quieter. Colder. Like a realization settling into place after years of being just out of reach. My father didn't need me to be a liar because he believed I was one. He needed me to be a liar because the alternative required him to confront something he had spent too long avoiding. Something about who I had become. Or who he had been when I needed him to see me. Back in the courtroom, as their attorney finished outlining his argument, I could feel the weight of that realization sitting just beneath the surface. They had spent years erasing me in private. Now they were asking the court to make it official. To turn absence into evidence. To turn silence into proof. I lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale hadn't moved. But something in her expression had shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Like a memory pressing forward against restraint. And for the first time since this began, I understood something with complete clarity. My father wasn't the only one in this room who knew more than they were saying. The afternoon light shifted just enough to turn the courtroom windows into pale mirrors. Faces blurred against the glass spectators, reporters, the quiet outline of a cousin I hadn't seen since I was 15. Everyone watching a story they thought they understood. On paper it was simple. A father correcting a lie. A daughter exposed. That was the version being built piece by piece with careful language and well-placed doubt. And I was sitting at the center of it, silent. Your Honor, my father's attorney said, stepping forward with a file in his hand, we'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit 7. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He didn't need to. This is a certified report from a civilian-accessible Department of Defense database. We conducted a search using the defendant's social security number and full legal name. There is no record of enlistment, no active duty history, no discharge documentation available through standard verification channels. He let that settle. No record, he repeated. The phrase echoed differently the second time. Not just an absence, a conclusion. The kind people were trained to trust. A few heads nodded, subtle, controlled, the way people agree without wanting to seem too eager. I didn't move. Additionally, he continued, we have obtained financial statements indicating that the defendant has received monthly deposits associated with veteran assistance programs, housing credits, therapy subsidies, benefits designated for individuals with verified service-related trauma. He placed another document down. The question before the court is not merely whether these benefits were received, it is whether they were received under false pretenses. False pretenses. I felt the words pass over me like something cold. Not sharp, not immediate. Just steady. Miss Whitmore, he said, turning toward me for the first time, would you care to explain to the court how you obtained these benefits? The room quieted. It wasn't loud before, but this was different. Focused. Anticipating. I could feel it, every pair of eyes, every assumption waiting for confirmation. I lifted my head. I filed through a legal aid group, I said. My voice carried evenly, using the documentation available to me. And that documentation would be, he pressed. Restricted, I said. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not surprise. Opportunity. Restricted, he repeated as if testing the word. So the court is expected to accept that your entire claim to military service rests on documents that cannot be independently verified. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have one. Because I knew how it would sound. Yes, I said. A murmur moved through the room, louder this time, less controlled. I heard someone shift in their seat, a pen scratching faster across paper. The narrative was tightening. My father leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. This was what he had been waiting for. A moment that sounded like confirmation. He didn't smile. He never did not in situations like this, but there was a stillness in him that I recognized. Satisfaction held carefully beneath the surface. Let's be clear, the attorney said, his tone sharpening just enough to draw a line. You are asking this court to believe that you served in the United States Army in a capacity significant enough to warrant both commendation and ongoing benefits. Yet there is no publicly accessible record of your service, no unit willing to come forward under your name, no commanding officer prepared to testify. He paused. No verifiable evidence. He let the silence do the rest. Just your word. Just your word. I let the phrase sit there. It sounded smaller than it was, less than what it carried. Because my word wasn't just a statement. It was the sum of everything I had done in places no one in that room had ever seen. Everything I couldn't bring into this space without breaking something I had sworn to protect. But none of that translated here. Here it was absence. Here it was doubt. I shifted slightly in my chair, my hand still folded, my posture unchanged. Across the room, a reporter leaned forward, eyes narrowed as if trying to catch the exact moment I would break. I didn't give it to her. The judge hadn't spoken, not since the questioning began. But I could feel her attention. Not the kind that watches for mistakes. The kind that listens for something beneath the words. Miss Whitmore, the attorney continued, if you truly served, there would be people living, verifiable individuals who could confirm your presence, your role, your actions. He took a step closer. Where are they? The question landed harder than the others. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I did. Too many. Faces, voices, names that came with images I didn't let myself revisit unless I had to. Some of them were gone. Some of them had moved on into lives that didn't include courtrooms and public testimony. And some of them were tied to operations that were never meant to be discussed outside very specific channels. I looked up, not at him, at the bench, at Judge Marion Vale. Her expression hadn't changed, but her hand had. It rested against the wood of the bench, fingers slightly curled as if holding on to something. I'm here, I said quietly. It wasn't the answer he wanted. He frowned slightly. I'm sorry. I'm here, I repeated. That's not what I asked, he said, a note of impatience slipping through. No, I said, it isn't. I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to let him see that I understood exactly what he was doing. Then I looked back at the judge. There was a shift. Small, but real. Her eyes moved not away from me but inward, as if aligning something. A detail. A memory. Something that had been out of place until now. Your Honor, the attorney said, turning back toward the bench, the plaintiff's position remains clear. Without verifiable evidence, the defendant's claims amount to narrative. And narrative, no matter how compelling, does not meet the standard required for the benefits she has received or the identity she has constructed. Narrative. My life reduced to a story. Something told. Something doubted. Something optional. The judge inhaled slowly. I saw it, the rise and fall of her shoulders, controlled, deliberate. She glanced down at the documents in front of her, then back up. Not at the attorney. At me. Miss Whitmore, she said, her voice, even during your service, were you ever assigned to a unit operating outside standard reporting structures? The question landed differently. Not for the room. For me. Yes, ma'am, I said. A flicker again, subtle but unmistakable. Can you elaborate, she asked. No, ma'am. Another pause. Not because you are unwilling, she said. No, ma'am. Because you are unable. Yes, ma'am. The room shifted again. Confusion this time, unease. This wasn't following the expected path. She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Was there, she continued, an incident involving a convoy and an IED detonation during your time in Kandahar? The air changed. Not dramatically, but enough. I felt it in my chest before I fully processed the words. Yes, ma'am, I said. My voice didn't waver, but something inside me did. Following that incident, she said, were you involved in providing immediate medical intervention to personnel on site? The memory came back sharper this time. Heat, noise, the weight of someone in my hands. Yes, ma'am. Her gaze held mine. Do you recall she asked a secondary extraction involving a legal liaison attached to the operation? The room was quiet. Too quiet. Because no one else understood what she was asking. But I did. I swallowed once. Her arm was hit, I said, high on the shoulder, arterial bleed. We had to stabilize before airlift. A pause. She kept asking for a report log, I added. Wouldn't let it go even when she was fading. The corner of the judge's mouth moved. Not a smile. Recognition. I remember, she said softly. The words didn't carry far. But they didn't need to. They weren't for the room. They were for me. The attorney shifted, clearly uncertain. Your Honor, I'm not sure how this line of questioning. She raised a hand. He stopped. Not because he agreed. Because something in her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. She looked back down at the bench for a moment. Then up again. Her eyes steadier now. Resolved. Counselor, she said, her voice returning to its formal cadence, you asked where the proof was. A pause. You may want to reconsider the scope of that question. The room held its breath. And for the first time since the case began, the version of the story my father had built, clean, controlled, unquestioned, began to show the first fine fracture. The fracture didn't sound like anything at first. No crack, no sharp intake of breath. Just a subtle misalignment in the rhythm of the room, like a metronome slipping half a beat off time. People felt it before they understood it. You could see it in the way shoulders stiffened, in the way the attorney's confidence shifted into something more cautious, more deliberate. My father noticed it too. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing into the table, his posture tightening not in panic but in control. He was recalculating, adjusting, the way he always did when a conversation didn't move in the direction he intended. But this wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't his room anymore. Your Honor, his attorney began, forcing a lightness into his tone that didn't quite hold with respect. Anecdotal recollections, however sincere, cannot substitute for verifiable documentation. The court must rely on... Counselor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The single word settled over the room with a weight that pressed everything else down. He stopped. Not mid-sentence, mid-thought. Judge Marion Vale didn't look at him. She looked at me. And for the first time since the proceedings began, she didn't look like a judge weighing arguments. She looked like someone remembering something she had tried very hard not to forget. You asked where the proof was, she said again, slower this time, each word placed with care. You asked for a verifiable account, a witness, a confirmation that could withstand scrutiny. She rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried. Deliberate. The kind of motion that doesn't seek attention but commands it anyway. The room shifted with her. Chairs creaked. Someone in the back straightened instinctively as if called to attention by something older than protocol. My father's attorney glanced at the clerk, then back at the bench, uncertainty now visible in the tightness around his eyes. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, she said. Still calm. Still measured. But final. She stepped forward from behind the bench. That alone was enough to break the rhythm of the room. Judges don't do that. They remain elevated, removed, contained within the structure of the proceedings. She didn't. She moved into the space, into the same air we were breathing. And then slowly she reached for the front of her robe. The fabric was dark, heavy, designed to conceal, to standardize, to strip away individuality in favor of authority. Her fingers found the fastening at the collar. There was a moment, brief, suspended, where no one seemed to understand what was happening. And then she undid it. One motion. Clean. She slipped the robe from her shoulders. The sound it made as it fell was soft, almost nothing. But the absence it created, that was loud. Beneath the robe, she wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the line of her forearm. And there, just below the shoulder where the fabric pulled back slightly as she moved. A scar. Not recent, not clean. Old. The kind that doesn't fade completely no matter how much time passes. The kind that tells a story without needing to be explained. This, she said, her voice steady, is what you're asking me to disregard. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it were waiting. I did not intend, she continued, to introduce personal history into these proceedings. It is not standard practice, it is not encouraged, and it is not something I take lightly. Her gaze shifted then. From me. To my father. For the record, she said, I will clarify the relevance. She took another step forward. Years ago, before I ever wore this robe, before I ever sat on this bench, I was assigned as a legal liaison to a joint operation in Kandahar. My role was observational, administrative, detached. A pause. That detachment did not survive contact with reality. I didn't breathe. Not fully. Because I knew where she was going. And I knew what it would cost her to say it. There was an incident, she said, a convoy, an IED detonation, immediate casualties. Her hand lifted almost unconsciously toward the scar. I was not meant to be in the primary response zone. I was not equipped for it. I was not trained for it. Another pause. But I was there. Her eyes met mine. And I would not be here now if she hadn't been. The room broke, not into chaos, into silence so complete it felt like something had been removed. Sound, movement, certainty. All of it. Gone. The defendant, she said, her voice tightening just enough to carry something beneath the control, was the first to reach me. She identified the injury, applied pressure, stabilized the bleed long enough for evacuation. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She did not ask who I was. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for instruction. A breath. She acted. My father shifted. It was small, barely noticeable. But I saw it. The first crack. Not in the story. In him. I have the scar, she said. I have the medical record. And I have the memory of a young officer who held an artery closed with her hands while everything around us burned. She let that settle. Not as a statement. As fact. The woman you have described to this court as unstable, as fraudulent, as attention-seeking, her voice sharpened just slightly, is the reason I lived long enough to become the judge you now stand before. No one wrote. No one whispered. Even the reporters had stopped moving. Because this wasn't something you captured in shorthand. This was something you witnessed. My father's attorney opened his mouth, closed it. Tried again. Your Honor, with respect, this is highly irregular. Personal testimony of this nature is admissible, she said, when it directly addresses the credibility of the claims being made. She stepped back then, but not behind the bench. Not yet. And if you require documentation, she added, you will receive it. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. The sound was quiet, but in that silence it carried. A clerk entered, moving quickly, but without urgency, a sealed envelope in hand. Delivery for the court, he said. The judge nodded. The envelope was placed on the bench. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at my father. Really looked at him. Not as a plaintiff. As a man. You have asked this court to determine whether your daughter is who she claims to be, she said. Her voice had returned to its formal cadence. Controlled, precise. But there was something under it now. something that hadn't been there before. You have asserted repeatedly and publicly that she has constructed an identity based on fabrication. A pause. And you have done so with conviction. She opened the envelope. Paper slid free. Official, stamped, marked in a way that didn't belong to civilian systems. These documents, she said, scanning them briefly, have been released under an emergency declassification order, authorized within the last 12 hours. A ripple moved through the room. Sharp this time. Uncontained. Service records, she continued. Deployment logs, commendations, chain of command verification. She lifted one page slightly, and a field report bearing the signature of the commanding officer present at the Kandahar incident in question. Her eyes lifted, which aligns with the testimony I have just provided. My father didn't move, not immediately, but something in his posture had changed. The certainty, gone, replaced by something harder to name. Not disbelief, recognition, the kind that comes too late. You asked for proof, she said one last time. Her gaze didn't leave his. You have it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had just been said, of everything that could no longer be unsaid. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just exhaled, slowly, carefully, as if I had been holding something in place for years and had finally been given permission to let it go. The robe lay where she had left it, folded into nothing, authority momentarily set aside, truth standing in its place. And across the room my father sat very still. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man who had run out of ways to control what came next. The ruling itself didn't come with drama. No gavel slammed, no raised voices, no moment crafted for spectacle. Judge Marion Vale returned to the bench, the robe back in place, not as concealment, but as structure. The room shifted with her reforming around the familiar lines of procedure. But something essential had already changed. You could feel it in the way no one leaned back into comfort. The case was dismissed with prejudice. The words were precise, final, not just a loss for the plaintiff, but a closure of the path he had chosen. There would be no refiling, no second attempt to reshape the narrative through a different angle. My father's version of me had just been denied the one thing he trusted most: legal permanence. There was a brief discussion of potential sanctions language, about abuse of process, reputational harm, the misuse of the court as an instrument of personal correction. His attorney tried to recover ground, to reframe the intention as concern, as confusion, as a family matter taken too far. It didn't land. The judge listened, acknowledged, then moved forward. There are moments when a system reveals exactly what it can and cannot do. It could clear my name. It could not repair what had been broken long before we entered that room. People began to move. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, the low murmur of voices returning tentative at first, then more certain as the structure of the courtroom reasserted itself. A young woman in uniform stood near the aisle, her posture straight, her expression composed. When I stepped past her, she raised her hand in a quiet, respectful salute. I returned it with a nod. Nothing more. Nothing needed. Behind me, someone whispered my name, not loudly, not for attention, but as if confirming it existed. Elena Whitmore. For a long time, hearing it in public had felt like exposure. Now it felt neutral, like something that no longer required defense. I didn't wait for my father to approach. I didn't look for him. But as I reached the doors, I felt it, the shift in the air that comes when someone is watching you with intention. I paused. Not out of obligation, out of clarity. Then I turned. He was still seated. The room had emptied around him in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her posture unchanged, though her eyes had lost their usual focus. My father's gaze met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There were 1,000 things he could have said. Explanations, justifications, a version of apology that never quite used the word. He had always been good with language, always able to shape it into something that sounded reasonable even when it wasn't. But now there was nothing left to shape, "You made this public," he said finally. Not loud, not angry, just a statement. As if that were the part he couldn't reconcile. I held his gaze. "No," I said, "you did." The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was hollow. He looked at me for a second longer as if searching for something he recognized. Then he nodded. Once. A small movement. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just acknowledgement that the conversation, whatever it had been, was over. I didn't wait for more. I turned and walked out. Outside, the air was thick with late afternoon heat. Humidity pressed against my skin, grounding in a way the sterile cold of the courtroom never could be. Reporters had gathered near the steps, microphones, cameras, questions already forming in their posture before they were spoken. "Captain Whitmore, do you have a statement? Can you respond to the allegations?" I kept walking. Not because I didn't have answers, because I didn't need to give them here. Not anymore. The truth had already arrived. It didn't require amplification. That night, I stood in my apartment, the window cracked just enough to let the city's distant noise filter in. A siren somewhere far off. The low hum of traffic. Life continuing in a rhythm that had nothing to do with what had happened that day. I poured a glass of water, set it down, and let the quiet settle. I had imagined this moment before. The end of it. What it would feel like to have everything laid out, confirmed, validated. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like absence. Like something that had occupied too much space for too long had finally been removed. Not replaced. Just gone. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Heavy paper, my father's handwriting. I recognized it before I opened it. Inside, the language was exactly what I expected. Measured, formal. There was mention of regret, of misinterpretation, of the complexities of family dynamics under pressure. He signed it. Daniel Whitmore. No dad. No attempt to bridge the distance. Just a name. The same way he had addressed me in the lawsuit. I read the first paragraph, then I stopped, folded the paper, and set it aside. Not out of anger. Out of understanding. Some people don't apologize. They revise. And I was no longer interested in revisions. I moved 3 months later. A small house in western North Carolina just beyond the edge of a forest that seemed to breathe on its own. The kind of place where the air changed with the time of day, where silence wasn't empty, but full of small steady sounds, whined through trees, water moving somewhere you couldn't quite see. I found work at a regional veterans clinic. No title on the door. No nameplate. Just Elena. Most of the people who came through didn't ask about my past. They didn't need to. They carried their own. The smell of diesel that made someone pause mid-sentence. The way a sudden noise shifted a room without explanation. The quiet understanding that some stories are told in fragments and some are never spoken at all. I listened. Sometimes that was enough. One evening after a long day, I stepped outside and sat on the bench I had built behind the house. The sky was clear. Stars, sharp and unfiltered, spread across it in a way you don't see in cities. I held a photograph in my hand. Grainy, old. Me kneeling beside a vehicle that no longer existed, my hand stained my expression set in a way I barely recognized. In the corner, barely legible. Vale. She had sent it without a note. No explanation. She didn't need one. I placed the photo on the small shelf inside above the fireplace. Not next to medals. Not as a display. Just where I could see it. A reminder. Not of what I had proven. Of what I had lived. I don't measure time the same way anymore. Not by deployments. Not by court dates. Not by the absence of calls that never came. I measure it by quieter things now. How long the light lingers on the porch in late afternoon. The shift in the wind before a storm. The way my name feels when I say it out loud. Elena Whitmore. Not as something I have to defend. As something that simply is. My father never called. I don't know if he read the full ruling. I don't know if he understands what he did, or if he's found a version of the story that lets him keep moving without looking too closely. It doesn't matter. Closure isn't always an apology. Sometimes it's the absence of the need for one. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite who you are quietly, persistently, until even you start to question it, then you understand something most people don't. The truth doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always come with recognition or applause. Sometimes it shows up in a room where no one expects it and refuses to leave. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to stand still while someone else tried to define your life for you, I'd like to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. There are more stories like this. Stories about truth, about silence, about the moments that change everything in ways no one sees coming. Subscribe if you want to stay with us. We're just getting started.